Is it all right if I can stand here?
Everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Earl Gammon. I'm a lecturer in global political economy in the Department of International Relations at Sussex. I'm very happy today to actually introduce my colleague, Dr. Benjamin Selwyn, who is a lecturer, senior lecturer in international relations and development studies. Now, Ben has been, I'm very impressed with his work, extremely prolific in the department, and has recently published his latest book, his second book, The Global Development Crisis, which matches part of today's title of his talk, and this was published by Polity this year. His first book, published in 2012, Worker, State, and Development in Brazil, Powers of Labor, Chains of Value, also established Ben's work and his critical scholarship within the field of development studies. Now, what I want to say today is today's talk by Ben is recorded, and the talk will last for about 40 minutes. It is also being streamed live, so welcome to those who might be watching this online. So Ben, after 40 minutes, we will be open to questions. And also we invite questions from those who might be watching this broadcast online. But the floor is yours, Ben.
Thanks very much, Earl. It's a real pleasure to present here, especially with the IDS is saying here, fighting poverty deserves original thinking. Hopefully I'll be able to provide some of that today. I just wanted to start off by saying that we all like to think of, we understand what development is, but we should start by recognizing, as the great French philosopher Michel Foucault noted, that development, just like any other key word, is a discourse. That is, it is a way of speaking and describing the world that contributes to the reproduction of that world. And you can see this discourse in action all over the place. So, for example, Jim O'Neill talks about the BRICS, then he talks about the mints, and he creates this image of a world where the new emerging economies are queuing up to enter the development club. Now, if I was an enterprising academic, I would say I would get Miley Cyrus on side and say a new set of economies of the twerks, and get her to do a little song with that, and show how these next economies are going to become rich. That's his deal. He's making a name out of that. Martin Ravalion of the World Bank is also engaged in another example of discursive construction when he says the global middle class in the middle income countries are those living above $2 a day. That's a statement from him, and again, that's an example of a discourse. But I want to get into the question of poverty and relate it to the question of global capitalism and global labour. I just want to start by giving a few facts on global poverty and inequality. So, for example, I'll start off the book by saying the contemporary world is characterized by, on the one hand, unprecedented wealth, and on the other hand, mass poverty. So, for example, total global wealth stood at around $241 trillion in 2013 and is expected to rise to $334 trillion by 2018. So, wealth growing constantly despite global economic crisis. At the same time, Oxfam makes the point that 85 people control half the world's wealth, and it also researched elsewhere showing that in 2012 alone, the 100 richest people increased their wealth by $241 billion. They also calculated that $241 billion would be enough to eliminate global poverty, that is, those living on $1.25 a day, 4 times over if it was distributed across the world. Another study looks at sub-Saharan Africa, and it shows that sub-Saharan Africa has external debts of 177 billion US dollars, but then it goes on to say the following: sub-Saharan Africa experienced an exodus of more than $700 billion in capital flight since 1970. Africa is a net predator to the rest of the world in the sense that its foreign assets exceed its foreign liabilities. But there is a key difference between the two. The assets are in the hand of private Africans, while the liabilities are public, owed by the African people at large through their governments. One of the big problems with mainstream development discourse, as exemplified in the World Bank, WTO, IMF publications and people who support those positions, is that these kinds of figures are not reflected upon in the sense that there is never a discussion over whether there should be any public democratic control over the production of that wealth in itself. Because if there was, then it could be quite easily seen that Sub-Saharan Africa would not be a debtor country anymore, that it could have invested large amounts of money in all kinds of other activities that would relieve poverty. Now, my argument in the book, I start off by saying that the mainstream discussion and conception and discourse about development is an essentially residualist one. The residualist conception starts with the assumption that the poor are poor because they're excluded from the benefits of the world economy. Exclusion. So UN Millennium Development Project Director Jeffrey Sachs, he defends the proliferation of sweatshop labour across the global south by saying, and I quote, "Sweatshops are the first rung on the ladder out of extreme poverty." Now, Jeffrey Sachs should know a thing or two about extreme poverty, as he was intimately involved in plunging millions, tens of millions of people in Russia and in Bolivia into poverty with their structural adjustment programs in the 1990s. But the point is, he is constructing a discourse there where inclusion into the world market legitimates the setting up of sweatshops and proliferation of sweatshops in places like Cambodia and Bangladesh. And the problem here is, and this is one of the big paradoxes of development, because we all want a better world, but development discourse, whether it is mainstream or slightly critical, rests on a number of assumptions, which I find to be deeply troubling. And that is that development policy consists of enlightened actors, that is states, entrepreneurs, international institutions and non-governmental organisations carrying out actions for the poor. The poor are portrayed in development discourse as disempowered. They need to be empowered by benign assistance from above. Right at the sharp end of this way of thinking, you've got people like Paul Collier, who advocates neo-colonial intervention into poor countries to remove dictatorships and enable poor people to gain access to the benefits of the market. Now, at the heart of the residualist approach to understanding development, there are a set of basic foundations in thinking. First of all, the markets are seen and portrayed as benign zones of exchange. Secondly, this exchange takes place between individuals, and so there is a sense of methodological individualism, where individuals are seen to bring their social capital to the market, or their other forms of capital to the market, and try and find the best exchange for that capital in order to better themselves. In this way of thinking, class and class relations are really sidelined and really ignored in place of focus on individuals and the benefits of the market. So the key problem in much development thinking is how individuals and groups of individuals are sidelined from the market. I want to argue in this talk that there is a fundamental paradox within much development thinking, and this is a paradox that you can show taking place. You could say this is a discourse, but you can also have empirical documentation of this argument. And that is that the poor are seen to be forced to participate in an economic system that rests upon their exploitation and oppression. That is the essence of a large chunk of development discourse and action and policy. But how would that be the case? Because, of course, not one person in the development industry, which is growing by the day, would ever say, our aim is to save the poor by oppressing them and exploiting them. Of course not. Those in the development industry argue that these forms of exploitation and oppression are actually zones of freedom and opportunity. So, for example, Frederick von Hayek, Thatcher's advisor, one of the key thinkers in the neoliberal development of neoliberal thinking, he argued in the 1970s in response to all of the protests about the terror of the Pinochet regime that had toppled Allende, killed thousands, imprisoned thousands, and oppressed thousands. He said the following: "I have not been able to find a single person, even in much maligned Chile, who did not agree that personal freedom was much greater under Pinochet than it had been under the deposed former president Allende." So freedoms rather than oppression are the discourse of the neoliberals. Similarly, a whole range of statist theorists, they recognise that labour needs to be oppressed, but they see that this is not necessarily a problem, as labourers are compensated by the formation of their human capital. Now, what is interesting there is that human is simply it is subordinate to capital in that phrase, and it's seen as acceptable for workers to be oppressed and exploited in exchange for the development of human capital. And you can get this from people like Hadrian Chang, Alice Amsden, and others. Now, lots of theorists, including from the World Bank, would argue that the current situation is one where international poverty is declining. Now, the reality is the bank is very unsure about these figures, about $1.25, $2 a day. They keep revising it, and they keep recognising that they've got previous calculations wrong. But again, this is an example of a discursive construction, this idea of $1.25 and $2 a day being the extreme and the poverty lines. For example, the New Economics Foundation, we had a very good talk a few weeks ago by David Woodward here. They calculate that poverty line should be around $5 a day. Reliant Pritchett, who is an insider in the World Bank and a very critical one at that, calculates that poverty line of $10 a day. Under these figures of $5 and $10 a day, you get a very different situation looking at world poverty, and you get a very different view of the nature of poverty and those who are impoverished. The ILO, who you'd think, the International Labour Organization, you'd think that they have a better claim on the interest of the world's poor because they represent labour. They use the same statistics as the World Bank, and they get caught up in the whole discursive framing of poverty and the poor as the World Bank. So, for example, the ILO, they don't start at $2 a day, they start to say those at $4 a day up to $13 a day are considered middle class. Now, I've done research in northeast Brazil, my first book is about that, and the workers who I interviewed were earning around more than $4 a day, and there's no way they would consider themselves middle class, and there's no way objectively you can look at them and say they are middle class. They're very solidly working class, subordinate to dictates of capital accumulation and control by bosses in the grape farms where I did my research. My argument is that when you look at the global labouring class, it has increased from around 1 billion to over 3 billion since the 1980s to today. The World Bank and the International Labour Organization calculate that roughly 1/3 of that international labouring class is living under $2 a day. That is, living in some kind of poverty, is considered working poor. If you adopt a slightly more humane conception of poverty at say $5 or $10 a day, you would have to conclude that the majority of the world's labouring classes are poor. Then you'd have to ask the question, what is it about being a labouring class, working class, that makes you poor? And my argument is that the majority of the world's labouring class is poor because it works for global capitalism. Global capitalism, the capital-labour relationship, is the reason that the majority of the world's labouring classes are poor. And that, of course, doesn't sit well with the World Bank or other neoliberal institutions who want to show that their medicine of neoliberal free markets and so on is leading to the uplifting of the world's poor. Now, that's my argument. But what alternative can I have to the mainstream conception where we understand poverty as a concept, as a result of a residualist approach, that is, from exclusion from the world market, exclusion from the opportunities of the market? My argument is that we need to have a relational approach, and I take this argument from Henry Bernstein, and he says, and to quote him, we need to ask, why are some poor because others are rich, and vice versa? What are the mechanisms that generate both wealth and poverty is two sides of the same coin of capitalist development. So my argument is that the relational approach is fundamental, and that right at the heart of the relational approach is class analysis, which again is pushed out and marginalised within most development discourse. And for me, classes can be defined as the social relations between producers and non-producers. So my book starts off by mentioning what I've just said. It rejects the residualist approach, it rejects neoliberalism, and it engages in a critical discussion with a whole range of thinkers who, in one way or another, take up the relational approach. I talk of people like Friedrich List, Alexander Gerschenkron, Marx, Trotsky, Joseph Schumpeter, Karl Polanyi, and Amartya Sen, amongst others. They all reject the residualist approach. They all provide an alternative to liberal ways of thinking. So I'll just talk about a few of these thinkers now before going on to my alternative. Now, this is a critical discussion because I find these thinkers immensely useful, very valuable, but I also find many of them quite limiting. So the first thinker I think about and discuss is Friedrich List, who in 1841 published his book, The National System of Political Economy. And Friedrich List is seen as the founder of the infant industry argument, and followers of him include the statist tradition, people like Ha-Joon Chang, Robert Wade, Alice Amsden, and others. Now, List was very clear about the residualist discourse that is so prevalent today, about exclusion and about the need to be included into the market to reap the benefits of the market. So he wrote this, and this is where Ha-Joon Chang gets his idea of kicking away the ladder. So this is a quote from Friedrich List. He says, "It is a vulgar rule of prudence for him who has reached the pinnacle of power to cast down the ladder by which he mounted, that others may not follow. A nation which by protective duties and maritime restrictions has built up a manufacturing industry and a merchant marine to such a point of strength and power as not to fear the competition of any other, can pursue no safer policy than to thrust aside the means of elevation, to preach to other nations the advantages of free trade." Now, List was following Alexander Hamilton, who was responsible for forming one of the first major system of American national political economy, and they both argued that the idea of free trade was a form of hypocrisy that was imposed by the imperial nations, primarily Britain at the time, on other nations who were trying to achieve their own development. And so List argued for a combination of the state engaging in the economy and combining and coordinating the interaction of natural, physical and mental capital. And for him, mental capital was the most important, and this entailed the training and establishment of a well-skilled industrial labour force and a skilled cadre of industrial managers capable of working the workers to produce advanced manufacturers behind walls of protection to compete on the international market. And this idea of mental capital has evolved into the idea of human capital, and everyone's in favour of it. Whenever you go for a job, for example, you are told that you can train up, and this is seen to be part of a beneficial package of your remuneration. Now, Marx wrote a critique of List very quickly after List's critique. List's arguments have become extremely popular, and I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that no country has succeeded to industrialise without using Listian mechanisms of infant industry protection, of targeted subsidies, of investment by the state directly, of training, of competition, of managed competition against other countries. They have not developed through the free market liberal ideas that are pounded by the World Bank today. So List is very popular, and rightly so, and he's been taken up, and I would say that the main alternative argument to liberal ideas or neoliberal ideas comes from the statists, and now you see ideas of neo-developmentalism taking hold across much of the world. But List was critiqued by Karl Marx, who at a very young age of 26 wrote a piece on his book on the national system of political economy. And Marx said two things which are very important to consider when we're looking at attempts at national development. He argued firstly that List mystified the nature of the state. List presents the state in the national system, in his book, he presents the state as a supra-class institution, an institution that stands above classes. Now, of course, the state needed to take very strong action to coordinate the economy. It needed to discipline landlords. It needed to redirect resources from the agrarian sector to the industrial sector. And overall, the state needed to protect industrial capitalists, and it needed to control labour and ensure that wages would never rise to such an extent that they would threaten the profits of capital. And so Marx was saying List's portrayal of the state is a mystificatory one. He presents it as superclass when in fact it's deeply embedded in class relations and reflecting class relations, especially the states which attempt industrial catch-up development. And Marx made a second point, talking about this idea of mental capital. He says, and this is a quote from Marx's Critique, which was published in 1845. He says, under the present system, if a crooked spine, twisted limbs, a one-sided development and strengthening of certain muscles, etc., make you more capable of working, more productive, then your crooked spine, your twisted limbs, your one-sided muscular movement are a productive force. And when you look at countries like South Korea, contemporary China, and other countries that achieve late development along Listian lines, you see quite clearly that the labour forces there are nothing more than commodity inputs into the production process. Their ill health and their oppression and exploitation are a basic ingredient, a necessary ingredient for late development and catch-up development. Now, the statists kind of realise this. They don't hide away from it. They don't pretend these are spheres of freedom as liberals do. But they say this is a cost worth paying. So let me just quote from one of the statists who's talking about the example of Taiwan in the 1970s. He writes, inclusion of labour is obviously desirable in principle. Well, that's very nice. But note that if labour exclusion is part of a set of arrangements which generate high-speed growth, workers are protected to some extent by high labour demand. Labour exclusion also gives the government more room to manoeuvre when austerity comes, and that latitude can be used to restore fast growth more quickly. So, labour inclusion is desirable but not necessary, and if labour is excluded, read trade unionists sent to concentration camps, trade unions smashed, wages kept down, very harsh working day imposed. If that is the case, then labourers are protected by the nature of the market, which will create high demand for their labour. And so there is an irony here that a statist who is very critical of the market actually turns to the market for the salvation of labour in place of the state, because he recognises that the state cannot deliver this salvation and betterment, because workers are, after all, just carriers of labour power, and that labour power needs to be exploited. So Friedrich List and his modern day followers, I would say, represents and provides an extremely powerful critique of liberal development discourse. It shows that all countries that have achieved development have used the state. It dismantles the idea of a free market. On the other hand, it is based, and all of his followers base their arguments on the idea that labour power is simply a commodity input, and that it is okay and legitimate for late developing states to repress and exploit labour in order to achieve late capitalist development and catch-up development. In essence, they are arguing for the sacrifice of a generation or more of labouring classes in order to achieve development. So for me, it is a dead end. The statist approach is a dead end because it does not solve the question of the poor themselves achieving development. It actually leads to the impoverishment of the poor to a large extent. So who else can we turn to cast light on the nature of development and think through alternatives to this kind of development, to either liberal development or statist development? Well, another of the thinkers I talk about in the book is Amartya Sen, who his book Development as Freedom, published in 1999, was extremely successful and is rightly seen as one of the great thinkers in international development today. Amartya Sen starts off his book with a brilliant critique of growth-based development, saying some of the similar things that I've just said in my critique of statism, showing how growth-based development often legitimates inequality, poverty, impoverishment, systematic exploitation and oppression. Amartya Sen, writing in 1999, creates a brilliant vision of development as freedom. And you have to remember, from the 1980s onwards, with the onslaught of neoliberal development ideology, development as a grand project became increasingly dumbed down in the 1980s, where the ideology was get the prices right and everything else will follow. And in the 1990s onwards, it was re-envisaged through the post-Washington consensus and through benign state intervention, but it did not have the grand designs that the development thinking of the 1950s and 1960s had. Certainly did not have the grand design of the other development that Smith and other people have talked about in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so Amartya Sen is bringing development back to a grand state of affairs, and for that he should be complimented, and his book should be read and appreciated. He argues that development is a process of expansion of freedoms, and this is very important, and I completely agree with him. But my critique of Sen is that he falls back into the question of a residualist framing of analysis, and he also falls into the question of methodological individualism. And I'll go into that in a second. But Sen argues, first of all, that development can and should be understood as a process of expanding the real freedoms that people enjoy. This is a far cry from simply ending poverty or achieving basic needs. It is a much greater vision of development. So he says, development consists of the removal of various types of unfreedoms that leave people with little choice and little opportunity of exercising their reasoned agency. However, the intrinsic importance of human freedom is strongly supplemented by the instrumental effectiveness of freedom of particular kinds to promote freedom of other kinds. In other words, once you start promoting certain types of freedom, that will have a knock-on effect and promote other types of freedom, and you'll have a flowering of human freedom, human abilities, choices, and that will be an ongoing process. It is a beautiful, beautiful vision, without a doubt. For Sen, there is an important role for the state. Now, all of this I agree with. But Sen falls back into this residualist approach, which is so much associated with the neoliberal conception of development. So, for example, he argues very strongly for the inclusion of the poor into the markets. He criticizes those who are critical of the market as such. He says, to quote, "To be generically against markets would be almost as odd as being generically against conversations between people. The freedom to exchange words or goods or gifts does not need defensive justification in terms of their favourable but distant effects. They are part of the way human beings in society live and interact with each other, and less stopped by regulation or fiat." So the market is seen as a benign sphere that provides opportunities to interact and to generate further freedoms through that interaction. The market is a sphere of opportunity and exchange. And Sen talks again and again about individuals being excluded from the markets. He does not talk about social classes. And so what Sen is providing us with is a picture of the market as benign. He cannot understand, and he doesn't even bother engaging with those who argue that the market is in fact a sphere of the power of capital over labour. He rejects that, not just because he rejects Marx, because he draws on Marx a lot in his development of freedom, but because he rejects class analysis in favour of methodological individualism, and because he accepts the age-old trope that the market is a benign sphere. And Sen's arguments are not simply academic. He has influenced countless human development reports. He has influenced the way we think about development and how development policy is actually implemented. So in one of her very good critiques of the Arab human development reports, Lila Abu Lugod makes a point as a critique of Sen that this residualist approach, that is exclusion from market, is the problem, misses some of the fundamental processes of market inclusion. So she says, the fantasy about the magical value of work for women is a middle class one. It presumes that jobs are well paid and fulfilling. One must ask if work that is badly paid, backbreaking, exploitative or boring liberates women. Now we only have to think about places like Bangladesh, Cambodia and China to ask, is this kind of inclusion into the market, so-called, through this extremely harsh labour regime that all these countries have, especially in the manufacturing sectors, is that a form of emancipation? Now, of course, the World Bank would argue that it is, because these women and men are paid more than $2 a day, therefore they're part of the global middle class emerging around the world, and therefore we should celebrate them, as does Jeffrey Sachs, Martin Rebellion, and all kinds of other people. They would argue that is the case. Well, when you actually look more closely at these regimes, you see enormous human cost of inclusion into the market in this way. And you have to ask, is that really what development is about? Now, one of the chapters is on Marx, and it would have been quite easy to write a chapter, Marx is the best, everyone else doesn't quite get the message. But actually, Marx himself and later Marxists have also suffered extremely from many of these same ways of thinking. Marxism and Marx have been guilty of a kind of stagism, where the possibilities of reaching socialism or human betterment require first an initial period of heavy capitalist development. They've also been accused of Eurocentrism. So, for example, Marx, in his early writings on India in 1853, you can find them online. He writes about the role of the British in India, and he says the British have to fulfill a double mission, breaking down the old Asiatic mode of existence and building up a new one. He portrays Britain very much, the British role, however vile it is, as somehow progressive. And on these writings, people like Edward Said, John Hobbes, and many other people since have criticised Marx as being Eurocentric and therefore of no use really to the peoples of the global south. But only a few years later, in 1857, 4 years after writing those words, Marx looked at the Sepoy Mutiny in India against the British and he said, India is now our best ally. He supported it wholeheartedly. He supported wholeheartedly the Taiping Rebellion, again against the British. By the end of his life in the 1880s, he was looking at the Russian agricultural commune, and he saw this as a potential jumping off point, not to deep capitalist development, but to socialism on a world scale. So he was seeing the other, the peripheral, the oriental, the exotic, the excluded, as a potential leader of world historical change. So my argument is that as Marx matures, the accusation that he's Eurocentric falls by the wayside. But nevertheless, the ideas of stagism have been maintained within the Marxist tradition itself. So, for example, there's a very famous phrase from the 1970s that has plagued Marxists and progressive thinkers for a long time, and this is the argument that the poor in the global south are poor not because they are super exploited, but because they are not exploited enough. That's maybe an essay question that you get. And the argument is then, well, we need to support capitalism, just like people like Bill Warren did in the 1970s when he wrote his article, talking about capitalist development, spreading out, imperialism, pioneer of capitalism. We need to support the building up of industry, and then we can talk about the transition to socialism. Well, I would argue that Marx's writings dispense with that, as his discussion of the Russian Commune shows. So that's my critique. Earl says I've got 10 minutes, maybe I'll extend that to 15, take the liberty. I've seen colleagues go on and on and on. I'm not going to go on and on, just add another 5 minutes to that. So what is my alternative? Okay, so let me show you some pictures first. My alternative is the idea of labour-centred development, which I hope classifies as original thinking, although I'm sure some people would not like the idea too much. But here is a picture of Cambodian garment workers clashing with military police in Phnom Penh earlier this year. Here's a picture of Chinese women workers striking after a Foxconn pay rise. Here's pictures of the landless labourers movement in Brazil, occupying land, putting it into production, gaining livelihoods. Here's a picture of occupied factory in Argentina. And this is my concept of labour-centred development. Labour-centred development starts out by showing that market-centred development, that is the Friedrich Hayek fantasy, the Pinochet fantasy, or state-led development, that is the List and later Listian fantasy, is based on the fundamental conception of labour, not as workers, as people, but as labour power, that is a commodity that can be bought and sold and employed to the best use to accumulate capital. So workers are conflated with the labour power, and the question is, how do we best exploit labour power? How do we best exploit human capital in the mix with other forms of capital? Now, my argument is that in these regimes, labour is oppressed, exploited, subject to dictatorship, democratically in the political sphere, but also in the labour process in the factory. As we move across the screen, we get more democratic, more labour-centred forms of development. We get situations where labour is not simply a commodity, where you have certain aspects of decommodification of labour, where you have laws that ensure that workers are not paid sub-minimum wages, or that their wages are actually contribute to sustainable human livelihoods. You have, for example, a pro-poor development, which is orientated by the state towards the poor. And my argument is much of the pro-poor literature misses out the fact that this kind of pro-poor development is based on a certain relationship in class forces where labour is able to force the state to implement more progressive rather than less progressive forms of development. And as you move across the screen, you get situations where labourers have more control over society, perhaps social democracy, and more control within the factories, within the workplaces, within the sphere of producing wealth, where you have an ever-increasing process of expansion of economic democracy. And so you move from here and you see the whole nature of development changes. From one which is obsessed with economic growth, you can imagine George Osborne lying back fantasizing about the next year we can get 2% economic growth. What a low expectation by British standards. But that's what they fantasize about. Economic growth is not the objection or the objective of labour-centred development. Labour-centred development is about what Sen talks about, is about human flourishing, is about expansion of freedom, but it's based on class relations and the expanding power of the working classes vis-à-vis the state and vis-à-vis capital. So it's fundamentally about the balance of class forces. Now, I'll give you examples about labour-centred development. So, for example, in the 1970s, in places like Brazil, South Korea, South Africa, there was enormous movements by the newly established labouring classes that brought about end to dictatorship and apartheid, and the beginnings of some more democratic processes and some more improvements in the livelihoods of workers. In contemporary China, as the picture demonstrated, you have a rising tide of class struggles. The Chinese Labour Bulletin talks about how class struggles in China are not simply defensive anymore, that is, defending previous gains, but actually going on the offensive and gaining new gains, new objectives and achievements for labour. A new labour law in 2008 was implemented that gave some new rights to Chinese workers. Now, China is still a one-party state. I'm not talking about, we have not reached the mandate of heaven at all in China, but you can see the changing balance of class forces leads to significant improvements in the conditions and the developmental processes of labour. The example of the landless labourers movement in Brazil, since the 1980s, they have been able to settle over 350,000 families, gaining a livelihood by families that were cast out from the land in the 1970s under conservative modernisation, were unable to find work, and were subsequently able, through their own actions, to achieve some form of human development. Another example, in Argentina, another picture there, is that workers in Argentina, following the crisis in the early 2000s, instead of accepting unemployment as a necessary corrective to market imbalances, took things into their own hands, occupied factories, and it is interesting that in these factories, employment has increased, wages have gone up, productivity has increased under worker control. There are all kinds of other contradictions taking place there, but nevertheless, this is an example, a small example, and there are still hundreds of factories in Argentina that are occupied and operating in such ways. This is a small example of how labour-centred development leads to developmental gains for labouring classes through the acts of labouring classes. And of course, when you look at Latin America and the pink tide, you see a changing balance of class forces behind these relatively progressive regimes, with all their contradictions, of course. Now, how do we think about this? The common assumptions about the poor in development thinking, as I've mentioned, they're poor because they're excluded from the benefits of the market. They require incorporation into the market through employment within competitive economic sectors. The primary developmental actors are states and entrepreneurs. The poor are the objects of development, and the elites are the subjects of development. Development is taken by the minority for the majority. It is a fundamentally elitist process, and when you think about it, it serves to reproduce the elitist hierarchy and elitist structure upon which these pro-poor policies are implemented. So labouring-centred development, or labour-centred development, is based on the assumption, or based on the proposition, and I've paraphrased the first statement of the First International, that the development of the poor must be achieved by the actions of the poor itself. It is not an elitist project in that sense. It is a project which looks to the actions of the poor, to the labouring classes, to achieve their own form of development. When you move across this screen, it is not a simple process of casting votes for the right parties. It is a process based on mass struggles. If you look at those struggles that I've mentioned, these have all involved quite a lot of violence, just as the establishment of the global labouring class over the last 30 or 40 years has involved a huge amount of violence, to peasants being forced off the land, to a labouring class collected in the slums, deprived of rights, forced to accept subsistence minimum wages. So it's based on struggle. It ultimately needs and requires revolutions against more the power of state and capital. So just to summarise and to conclude, on time actually, yes, very good. The residual conception of development simply reproduces the power of states and markets as the actors that can include the poor into the development process, and it excludes states and markets from analysis of how they actually reproduce development itself. There's a whole strand of Marxism, and Marx himself was mired in stagism and Eurocentrism, which I think we can simply get rid of. And once we do that, we actually see that Marxism has got much more to offer than these caricatures. Labour-centred development brings class firmly back into development studies. It's against elitism. It shows how the elites then shows how class struggles themselves are developmental, which is, I think, something totally lacking in development studies. And fundamentally, it envisages a world, somewhere around here, which is free of the exploitation of the masses by the minority. So it is a genuinely emancipatory vision rooted in the struggles of the here and now. And you can actually look at struggles in the here and now, like I did in northeast Brazil, and show how they are developmental. So it's not utopian in the sense that it only exists in the future. It exists in the here and now. We can take sides, we can analyse it, we can try and participate in it. Thanks.
Well, we have about 40 minutes to take questions from the audience. So what I'll do is I will take a selection of questions and let Ben catch his breath for a little bit. Any questions? Yeah, right here.
I'm a bit embarrassed to be asking the first question because I was late, but I do know of Ben's work from other times, and I think my main question, and there could be many, but one of the main important things I think is related to the actual diagram you have on the board, Ben, because I think I completely favour what you've said about reviving the concept of labour as the centre of what development should be about. But the problem is, for countries who want to make this transition, and I'm thinking of Venezuela, for example, do you think that you can move to labour-centred development without having some kind of mixture of market development or state development? So do you think it's compatible with having a mixed developmental policy? Or do you think you need to jump straight into the labour-centred development for it to succeed?
Okay, I had a question up here in the front.
Yeah, I was just going to ask for clarification what the lines are supposed to be on the diagram.
These lines?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm not proud of my technological backwardness, but this is a very good example of it. This is actually in the book, and I did ask the publishers to try and sort it out, but they weren't able to, maybe because the software I use is so bad as well. Basically, these lines denote the level of influence by states, by markets, which is basically capital, and by labour. And so when you go along this way, you get more influence by labour, more space people like Robert Wade, Ha-Joon Chang, they use the idea of developmental space, which is quite an interesting one for understanding the possibility of states pursuing their own development. So I'm using this concept of space here, but from a class perspective and looking at different social classes and how they interact. So it basically denotes more and less developmental space from class sense. You'll notice the lines face both ways, so it's completely contested at all times. Yeah.
Do you want to take the first question?
I'll take the first question as well. I think the idea that we could jump straight to situation where labouring classes control the entire developmental process is a little bit utopian. The struggles take place over time. There's necessarily a mix of statist, capital and labour. And the question is, can labouring classes continue that push and increase their influence over the state and over capital? And that involves not one revolution but many. It involves mass struggles. It's a necessarily disruptive process, but so is development. So it's not like we're counterposing a utopian peaceful process against a violent, nasty one. All development is violent and nasty, and the question is who does the violence and who benefits from it. At the moment it's elites against the masses, and this idea is one where the masses undertake the social transformation by themselves.
Yeah. So I have a question right there.
Yes, my first question is, given that the markets, as we want to call the capital, is now integrated, international, and above the states, how can the labor tackle and engage with those international markets? Because if the laborers, they have a struggle, they can maybe get a better labor law in their own country, but then the capital will move somewhere else. So do you think in this perspective to have an international labor union, we want to call it, that managed to have some sort of counter-offensive and to raise the class consciousness within the international labor class as opposed to the international capital? This is because the class struggle needs to be international to be effective, otherwise it wouldn't work. And second question is, who has got this role then eventually, and is there any space for the advanced not, you say, well, it's about mass, it's about not a space for elite, not a space for some sort of elite within the working class, but then this would somehow implicate that the working class is an immobile class. So what about the scaling up, moving up from the working class? And is the possibility to eventually move to in the class pyramid to a further one, or this immobility between the two will end to in a state without classes? This is the objective or not?
Any further questions at this point? Okay, as well.
Yeah, these are great questions. And these are really, really tough questions, and it's tempting for academics and intellectuals to try and solve these questions intellectually and academically through the writing, and it's well worth trying to do so, but ultimately it's not for us to decide. Human experience, class experience will show if this is a problem that can be surmounted. But it doesn't mean that we can't point to examples and demonstrate how classes, social classes have interacted and won gains within the concept of the global system. Now, one of the things I work on is global value chains and global commodity chains and global production networks. And one thing that's quite obvious is that these global production networks are, on one hand, a very powerful force that capital has to outsource labour, to achieve the race to the bottom or pursue the race to the bottom, to fragment the labour force, to raise the rate of exploitation across the whole chain, and to basically demobilise labour. There's no doubt about that. That is one of the main objectives. I mean, you can read The Economist and it says as much. On the other hand, though, once you have these global production networks, you also have a much greater vulnerability of capital to small disruptions at different nodes in the chain. Rather than the entire production process taking place within one factory, it takes place across hundreds of factories, and a disruption in one factory actually has impacts on all the rest of the factories across the world. It stops production. within the context of just-in-time production. So in the face of global capital, there are things like bullwhip effects, as I mentioned, or choke points in the supply chains, in the commodity chains, that actually represent vulnerabilities for capital. So this is one source of labour's power to mobilise against capital. But that's not the only source. I think the idea of global union federations is interesting. The idea of spreading knowledge and of trying to achieve a race to the top, where benefits for workers in one part of the value chain are communicated to trade unions in another part of the value chain, and the trade unions in the second part try and push the standards up so that the standards are raised across the value chain. I think this is an interesting idea. I think it's in its infancy at the moment. I think it's almost too easy to dismiss it, but it's something worth looking at. So these are just two examples, but ultimately, of course, the nation state remains and is reproduced and is fundamental to global capitalism. It's not being undermined at all. It is there, and it always has been there. It is the form that is able to discipline labour and control labour for capital. And so struggles within the state are obviously very important, and you can see them taking place in places like China and elsewhere. The pink tide and so on represents both transnational struggles, but also consolidated within the national sphere. So I wouldn't write off the nation state, and I wouldn't write off labour in the face of global capital. I mean, global capital has got huge power, but ultimately it is also vulnerable, and these vulnerabilities can be used by labour in productive ways. Yeah. Questions of elites within the working class. This is a very interesting question. I mean, you can look back at examples, for example, of the Paris Commune, where the workers who are elected to perform certain administrative functions, which in a normal capitalist state would be attached to quite a high level of power, had that power, did not have that power, did not accrue that kind of power. So they had workers' wage, they were subject to recall, for example, subject to democratic control. As you have increasing labouring class control over production and distribution of wealth and decision making, there would necessarily have to be an increasing level of democratisation. Otherwise, you're right, there could just be an emergence of an elite, and it could reproduce hierarchical situations. I mean, there's no guarantee that as you move across this diagram, you don't get new elites emerging. But that's not certainty either. It all depends on the ability of labouring class organisations to actually control their movements. So it's an open-ended question, but it's certainly something that needs discussing and thinking through.
Question here in the back.
Yes, thanks, Ben. I think it's very interesting and very thought-provoking. And I agree that labour should be more empowered, should be more protected, should be more organised. These struggles should become much more centre stage. Entirely agree with where you want to go. I just sort of have two questions really. One is, how will we get there? What will trigger an evolution in that direction? Just partly rephrasing an earlier question, really, because although you give examples of people having struggles, strikes, doing well, one could argue that there's as many examples of things going in the opposite direction. One could as well give examples of how neoliberalism has closed down unions, has created more trafficking of labour, unfair labour, bonded labour, slavery, etc., etc. It's a very long list where unions have collapsed and so on. So the question there is really, are you giving a descriptive model here of where you think the world is going, or is it a normative model of where you think the world should be going, how things should develop, which I think would be an interesting thing to reflect with further on your model. The second question, very briefly, is that it's really one about the role of the state in this, in thinking about populations who are no longer labouring. Because there's also a lot of evidence of parts of the world, particularly Africa, where people are a surplus population, not in the Marxist sense of a surplus reserve army of labour, but population who the market doesn't need anymore, who are sort of permanently unemployed, permanently left there. What would that model mean for them, and what would potentially be the role of the state for them? Not necessarily you can answer those here, but I think these are sort of two things that come to my mind.
Question here?
How do you conceptualize in the labour centre development? How do you conceptualize the different ideas and conflicts between the masses along other sort of struggles?
Can you give some examples?
Or along like more feminist ideas or conflicts. It just I mean, this is a simplified graph, but yeah, it's not about. I guess there's more struggles than just that class divide. So how can we conceptualize that within the labor-centered approach?
Any further questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
So you mentioned yourself social democratic parties, and which is somehow a part of the state eventually once in a while. So I wonder where you see the arena for this labor-centered development, because I assume that you want people to organize, as you also say, as a part of a democratic movement. But for example, in Brazil, we see more direct participation, and which is the opposite of like parties where you actually join the state or alternative movements.
Okay. Do you want to take those three?
Yeah. These are great questions, definitely. So, is it descriptive or normative? Yes, it's normative. I mean, this is the vision. This is my vision of development. Just like Amartya Sen has his vision of development as freedom, I don't think he's really saying that the world is going in that direction. He's saying there are many processes which actually prevent the world going in that direction, and so, but he provides that vision, just like the statists have their vision of all countries in the world following catch-up development and achieving catch-up development. So there's a very strong normative sense there, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. Classical political economy, which is a tradition I stand in, was very strongly normative. So that's clear. To what extent does it describe a process taking place? I completely agree that there is neoliberalism, contemporary nature of capitalism is really trying to force the situation over to this side of the screen, with labour, workers being reduced to the carriers of commodity input. I mean, you can see it with this government very clearly. You can see it across in South Africa, for example, many examples of that taking place. So that's pretty clear, I think, as well. I think one of the real contradictions is that, on the one hand, the objective forces for this kind of transformation are ever more present, in the sense that, as I mentioned, the ILO has documented how the growth of the global labouring class has more than tripled over the last 30 years. On the other hand, as you intimate too, there is all kinds of contradictions taking place within that class itself, including the fragmentation of labour, where workers are divided according to gender, ethnicity, race, geography through global production networks, where workers have different jobs, so even their job identification is fragmented. All of these contradictions and fragmentations mean that whilst the global labouring class is bigger than ever before, which is the simple Marxist fantasy in a way, it's not necessarily stronger in real terms or in subjective terms. Objectively, I would say it is. Subjectively, it's been very effectively divided. Now, my argument is also that this division, these fragmentations, are not an inevitable outcome. They are very much a part of the class struggle waged by capital in the state to discipline labour, to raise the rate of exploitation, and to exploit labour across geographies, across space and time. And so this is a very political project, this fragmentation, this creation of what Guy Stanley calls a precariat, which I disagree with his concept there. That is a political process of marginalisation, so-called marginalisation. And this comes to your question about the surplus populations or the real marginal populations. Of course, if you're not involved in the labour process in any way, it's hard to mobilise in these ways. I completely agree. But at the same time, there are all kinds of movements beyond the labour process which can have progressive outcomes and objectives. At the same time, because of this fragmentation, you can also have all kinds of really horrible reactionary ones, like in South Africa, the massacre of Zimbabwean immigrants, for example. So it goes both ways. But I would say that that fragmentation of labour is very much a product of this current phase of capitalist development, and is a purposive objective of the ruling classes across the world. Okay, so this question of divergent ideas within the labouring class, is it only class struggle or others? Yes, so this book is about 200 pages, and in the first few pages I say it can only do so much. There's a whole range of things I like to talk about, and I certainly, and several of them include things like the environment, question of gender, and these issues. One book can only do so much. My primary objective is to bring class analysis back into development studies and to place it at the centre and to actually redefine the way we think about development. It's not just about here we have development studies and here we parachute class analysis back in. It's actually saying if we start from class analysis we have a different development studies. And from that perspective it will have to necessarily confront all these issues, including issues of gender. I mean, I do write about it in my first book, questions of gender and women's rights and about women workers, but I do so from a relatively class perspective. So I hold my hands up and say it doesn't tick all the boxes in that way. But these issues, these divisions have to be confronted if this movement is to take place. I mean, one of the things that's notable about the expansion of the global labouring class is more and more women are involved. The fastest growing section of the global labouring class is women, and so these gender issues will have to come to the fore, and a lot of trade unions have historically been awful at dealing with women's issues and framing them and thinking them through. One encouraging thing is in my research in Northeast Brazil, the most charismatic leader of the trade union is a woman, and she is a very powerful speaker. She really puts the other male leaders into the shade, and she is a real mobiliser, and they have been able to mobilise questions of gender alongside class in a very effective way. So I'd say there are lots of confluences as well as contradictions and tensions between the two. The last question. So I'm not advocating a kind of idea of return to social democracy here. I'm saying that what I understand by social democracy is a process of decommodification of certain things like education, health, establishment of relatively generous minimum wages, slight decommodification of the labour market in some ways, access, basically meaning that workers are not completely dependent on the market for their social reproduction. They are dependent on other social forms which can be democratically constituted, which is what happened under social democracy in Europe in the 1950s up until the 70s and 80s. And one of the things I point out in a recent article is that this social democratic impulse was itself the product not of benign elites, but of the fear of revolution. I mean, it goes back to 1917, the fear of the Bolshevik Revolution. Lord Hailsham in Britain is a Tory MP. He says, either we give them social reform or they all give us social revolution. The balance of class forces forced capitalist states to engage in this process of decommodification of social life to give labouring classes a stake in the capitalist system. Now you can see that as a paternalism and as patronising and as a way of diverting labouring classes from their true goals, or you can see it as an outcome, and you can see it as an outcome of struggles from below. And the question is, how are those social forms constituted? Now, a lot of the time, going back to the question of gender, a lot of this social democracy and decommodification really left women in the home is centred around the idea of a male breadwinner. Under the present conditions where you have a growing number of women in the workforce, growing number of women in social life, more than men, I don't think it's conceivable that you could have a form of social democracy and decommodification without addressing gender issues in a much more meaningful way. My point is that I'm not calling for going back in time. I'm talking about thinking about the gains from the past and how they can be reconstituted through these movements in the present and in the future.
Okay. Further questions? Right here.
I was wondering where you stood and whether you advocated violent confrontation against the assembled forces of both the state and capital. The reason I ask is because there are various examples of instances in which it does seem that violent confrontations have been quite successful. If you look at BBC History magazine, for example, they were more than willing to admit that violence was essential in passing the Great Reform Act, whereas there are also people who say that, for example, Martin Luther King couldn't have been as successful as he was if he hadn't had Malcolm X standing right behind him. And in particular with labour struggles in America, Sidney Lennon in his biography speaks of incredible amounts of violence being necessary as a means of obtaining at least some workers' rights in the 1930s.
Any further questions at this point? Oh, did we? Oh,
yeah. I was also wondering where you stood on notions of branchianism, for example, relating to the war opposition and the notion of establishing a counter-hegemony.
So violence is always the stick that supporters of the status quo use to hit those who argue for something different. But the reality is, I mean, if you look at British rule in India, tens of millions died of famines, which were unnecessary. The Great Bengal famine, if you look at British rule in Ireland, there are so many examples of imperial rule which has led to the deaths of millions of people that it's implausible to argue that the capitalist system, the colonial system, the imperial system is not based on a huge amount of violence. And it's based on also a dull compulsion of violence. You see in Britain today increasing numbers of food banks, you see numbers of people being forced into poverty, people's lives being emasculated and people being deprived through economic forces. No one is actually holding a gun to the head or hitting them over the head with a stick. It is the economy that's doing it. What does the economy actually mean? It means the power of capital to determine whether certain sections of the labouring force is able to reproduce itself through its sale of labour, of its labour power on the market or not. And then it's a question of what the state does with those who can't do it. So it's obvious to me that the state and capital rely on their social reproduction on a high level of violence, organised, unorganised, legitimated and regularised through economic and non-economic means to reproduce their rule. So, I mean, that should be the starting point. And actually, the development process, when we talk about establishing a modern, up-to-date states and so on, we're also talking about a hugely violent process. It's not that violence is somehow residual or outside the development process. Violence is intrinsic to development. Development is a process of violence. There's no doubt about that. So then that raises the question, well, what do labouring classes do in response? I mean, meaningless violence, is there such a thing? I mean, violence has to be, or force. If you use the word force, I think it's better, because force is a necessity in terms of achieving this shift from one part of the graph to another. As I mentioned, the threat revolution is what brought about the welfare state. The huge uprisings in places like South Africa, South Korea, Brazil, these were violent movements. They were met by violence, by the state, and they responded with violence. But they led to what most people in this room and most people doing development would consider to be major improvements in the lives of people. Liberation across much of the global south, anti-colonial movements, all of these have been entailing violence. So the question is, what kinds of violence works and what kind doesn't work? And I suppose that is a political question for the here and now, both abstractly, theoretically, but also concretely. But this comes to the question of Gramsci, and I'm increasingly convinced that in this diagram it entails huge struggles and potential revolutions. And I think one of the problems that Lenin and Trotsky had was that they envisaged 1913 being the spark that would light an international revolution. And they said again and again, and they were quite correct in this, they said, without a revolution in Germany, we are finished. And they were finished, although not in ways that they predicted. Their mistake, I think, is that they expected these revolutions to break out very quickly after 1917. And what I think, with the lessons that we can draw from the 20th century, is that revolutions take place again and again. There's no doubt about that. It is not that we're living in a world free of class struggle revolution. The problem is revolutions don't take place in large masses across space, and that there are large time lags between one revolution and another, within countries and between countries. And so then the question becomes, what happens when you have a revolution, when you win political power or some aspects of political power, and the time when you actually have complete control over the economy and society to implement a much more labour-centred form of development. And it's in that phase, that time lag, it could be generational, that you need to have these kind of counter-hegemonic institutions that defend the gains of labour against the encroachments of state and capital. And one of the people I draw on is Michael Leibowitz, who talks in his book, Real Human Development, and his other book, Beyond Capital. He talks about encroachments upon capital and how labouring class organisations can encroach upon the reproductive function of capital. That is through decommodification, through ceasing to enable capital to determine exactly how workers reproduce their lives through the market, through actually insulating themselves from capitalist dynamics. There are other forms of encroachments over capital through the welfare state, through enhanced social democracy, through participation, through economic democracy, where you have controls over factories and so on. And so that idea of encroachments upon capital, I would say, is quite a Gramscian idea. It doesn't imply a clean break. It implies a long-term process, but not one that is stable, but one that is continually contested. And as you can see, any gains can be eroded quite quickly. So that's why these encroachments have to be institutionalised and protected. And that raises all kinds of questions about the rise of elites within the working class movement who actually want to subvert the original aims. So, of course, it's very difficult.
Question here. The concept of development you're criticizing is very attached to the context of capitalist expansion. Your idea of labour-centred development, is it still attached to that context? Or would you say it is possible to speak of labour-centred development in a non-capitalist society?
Yeah. A lot of people who are critical of contemporary development, but who are not utopian in the sense saying we need to get rid of capitalism, they criticise people who've talked about beyond capitalism, and they say about people like us, well, you've got this nice critique of capitalism, you've got this beautiful vision of the future, but you've got no idea of how to get there, and you've got nothing to say about the actual processes of development today, apart from total condemnation. And it's very easy to be critical. It's much harder to be inventive. But what this idea of labour-centred development tries to do is try to connect the struggles of today to the idea of a society, post-capitalist society tomorrow. So my argument is, I know you probably wouldn't get funding for this, but you could say, I want to do investigation into labour-centred development. I want to go to any part of the world and actually look at how labouring classes are able to or unable to ameliorate their conditions through their own self-activity. So it takes place now on a micro level, on a macro level, nationally, internationally. So it takes place in the here and now. There are all kinds of dynamics that lead to it or prevent it taking place. But normatively, and this goes back to Here's point, I would argue that those processes have within them the germ or the potential of something much greater, not just improvements in wages and conditions, which are themselves extremely important, but something actually much greater that can take us beyond capitalism. And this idea of economic democracy really shuts down the power of capital to determine resource allocation and production, and establishes democracy in the economy, unites politics and economics, and arguably is a post-capitalist society. So I'd say it connects the here and now to the potential future. And I'd also say it provides a raison d'etre for the trade unions at the moment, because a lot of trade unions, not only are they sectionalist and are stymied by all kinds of internal divisions, they often see their own actions simply as representing the needs of their members and so on. And I would actually say that trade union struggles are themselves developmental. And if you see them as developmental, you can say, how far do you want to go? And the trade union bureaucracy will say this far, the rank and file may say a lot further. And people within or outside, like say the National Union of Metal Workers in South Africa at the moment, say we want to go a lot further and we want to talk about a complete transition. And these ideas of transition are not bizarre. I mean, the ANC was talking about transition some time ago. The Workers' Party was talking about transition in Brazil. So this idea of transition is legitimate, and one should be embraced within development studies, rather than scaling our sights down, which I think a lot of development studies does. I mean, when you read World Development, for example, I mean, there must be a competition to find the most boring journal around, because every journal that you read is just so micro so many small case studies. It's like, oh my God, have you lost sight of the big picture of what human development is really about, or what it could be about? Journals don't talk about that. Academic work does not talk about that. That's very unfortunate. I've been rejected from World Development, so I'm not sure. But the article they rejected is published in Review of International Political Economy, which is better. So, not just sour grapes. Yeah.
We have a few minutes. Any additional questions? Yeah.
It's more of a kind of dialogue that I just want to contribute to. And we have been talking about trade unions with respect to labour-centred development. But I think I would like Ben's opinion of the role of social movements, because in fact social movements are a lot of looser kind of network. And in Colombia, they have worked extremely well, even on a non-violent level, because of the mass of people they're able to call up in demonstrations. And I'm talking about students' demonstrations, rural people's demonstrations, indigenous people who are also on the fringes of labour. They don't actually, link into the market in the same way. And also the Occupy movement. Now I know the Occupy movement, has not got to where it should be, and I think that's due to lack of aims and networking. But I think I'd like to you obviously do include it within that, because the problem is that trade unions are actually have very low membership. So
Sure.
I don't think that's the way forward.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of class analysis, or what passes for class analysis, divides classes up, like the ILO, like Martin and Rebellion, who talk about $2 a day or $4 a day. They look at income levels, they look at types of work, they look at identities, and they break it up into different social classes. And this is a fundamentally, this way of thinking about class just fragments a population into any number of different groups. And my conception of class, which is the relations between producers and non-producers, which is derived from Marx, is a fundamentally relational one, which basically talks about the majority class in the world at the moment is the class that is forced to sell its labour out, or try and sell its labour out, in order to reproduce itself. Now that will include unemployed as well as employed, white collar, blue collar, some workers earning good wages, others completely excluded from the labour market, excluded in inverted commas because they're part of the labour market anyway. It'll include students, it'll include many in the social movements. The question of this confusion about social movements is not, I wouldn't counterpose them against the working class or trade unions. There's often lots of interpenetration between the two. But I would say that the fragmentation of labour, which is a process that has really become more forceful over the last 30 years, has taken place in such a way that we now see this counterposition between labour and social movements. I would say social movements are very much part of the global labouring class. Of course, there are other elements, all kinds of political battles, as in any kind of movement, over the types of leadership to take place. But I wouldn't divide them at all.
Any further questions? Yeah, right there.
I think capitalist development have two major limitations: inequality and sustainability. And I think labor-centered development has big implications for inequality. But in terms of sustainability, I think it's totally different ideology. But do you have your idea has some implications for sustainability issues?
Do you mean sustainability in ecological terms?
Yeah, I mean, if we think about very long-term development, I think capitalist development surely has some limitations. So it's totally different
Sure.
idea, but do you have some implications?
I think capitalism will destroy the planet, and I don't think that will harm capitalism at all. There are all kinds of futures markets in rights to deal with pollution, carbon trading. You can make money out of anything under capitalism. I don't think there's any limit to capitalist expansion. It is completely sustainable in its own sense. As long as it has a labouring class to exploit, it'll be able to expand. So it doesn't matter if it's destroying the environment around us. That is immaterial. Capitalism is like a cancer, it just will continue expanding as long as it has that social base upon which it can grow further. Doesn't mean it's going to be nice at all. Sustainability for capitalism means unsustainability for the mass of the world's population. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay. One last question.
Hi, Ben. Thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering, it's a very quick question, is to what extent the concept of the idea of labor-centered development will operate or take place in different geographical contexts? So to what extent we conceptualize labor-centered development in Europe or the developed world that you have included basically in your analysis, or for example, how we engage with this in areas like Sub-Saharan Africa, or for example, Latin America, which in general represent different levels of capitalist development. And I was wondering to what extent you take that into consideration, because that is a massive variable historically within the Marxist debates, but as well to understand the global North-South divide.
Yeah.
So we have to understand as well the correlation between different geographies in order to reproduction of global capitalism, and to that extent, how that fit into labor-centered development.
Sure. No, I mean that is I always get that question, and it's a really tough question, because one answer to that would be you can only have labour-centred development once you've had sufficient accumulation of capital, once you've had large factories being established, once you've had a well-organised and well-paid labour force. Only then can you have the development of socialism or something more labour-centred. And this argument has been going through Marxism from day one. So I agree with that. Okay, so Marx himself was talking about the Russian commune, the agricultural commune, and he saw that as the pivot upon which global regeneration could take place. So he himself didn't think in those terms, I would argue. Okay, but that's not going to solve the question of what we say about Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, I gave the example of Sub-Saharan Africa previously, where you have something like $170 billion debt, whereas you have something like $700 billion held in assets abroad by the rich. Now, obviously, you're completely correct. The geography, the social makeup of any country will be a major determining factor on the nature of labour-centred development there. I would argue that labour-centred development in, for example, parts of Sub-Saharan Africa where there is large assets held abroad would centre around trying to democratically control those assets, put them to productive use, and so on. And there's so many progressive, green, ecologically sound ways of doing that could raise productivity, reduce the amount of labour necessary, create free time in the process of generating the basic needs and more. So I would say that even, okay, so that's one point. And the second point is I'm not advocating a jump from today to socialism tomorrow. I recognise, as I pointed out in the previous question, that this is going to be a generations-long process. And so the question is, what kind of growth do you have? Do you have growth where you have cash hoarding by huge firms across the world, which basically represents a human developmental opportunity cost? Or do you have a process of development where that cash, where that money, where resources are controlled and put to good use? That is part of the question. And I'd say I'd link those kinds of questions up to micro questions of geography and specificity, but also to the macro question about ultimately what kind of human development could we normatively argue for. But, I mean, this is a really tough question, so that's only a partial answer.
All right. Well, I'd like us to extend our thanks once again to Ben for such an extremely engaging lecture. And also to thank those of you who asked questions today. I just wanted to alert you to the fact that there are books. Ben's latest book is actually on sale here, so they did bring along a few copies. So if you are interested, by the description in front of you, they are here at this side. Thank you very much.